Hello and welcome to this episode of Write, Speak, Play. I'm your host, Nancy Arvizu. And in this episode, I am talking with author and poetess Sweta Vikram. Sweta and I go back about a decade, and she recently reached out to me to discuss her latest book, A Piece of Peace. And we delved into a couple of different, very deep topics. So, without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Sweta Vikram. Thanks for listening.
There's just so much that I think, especially for women, we forget how our emotions are so tied into our own healing. And trauma stays in our autonomic nervous system, and it can manifest into a chronic illness, an autoimmune 4 years later. It's called immobilization. And, when we think trauma, because I teach yoga to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So it took me a while also to understand, like, oh, that's not the only definition of trauma. Trauma could be a bad experience at work, an abusive, or even not even abusive, a rough upbringing, or a disruptive relationship. Trauma exists in so many forms. So my body was, I think this is not something I've talked about, but when people read the book, I will not go into details because it's traumatic for me, but I did witness a crime. And when I tried talking about it, um, a large majority didn't want to believe me, because then it's the person they had believed, the person I witnessed committing a crime. It's, people, it wasn't to hurt me, it was to protect themselves, because they knew that I am not the type who makes up stories and lies. That's not my personality. um, but believing me meant they had to disbelieve the other person, and then that shakes up the foundation for a lot of people. So I understand that from a distance, but that stress manifested in my body, and it stayed. Like, then my mom passed away, and you know it was one thing after another, and there came a time where I think my mind and body just couldn't take it anymore. And that's it became like a full blown chronic illness. I was in the ER. So I was in the ER, is a lot of people have heard about that, but anything prior to that that I just shared, they haven't. And it'll be a surprise when they read the book, because it's not, I mean, if I really wanted to call out on this person, I could have done that very easily. I don't get into those details because that's not the purpose of the book. The reason I even shared this is because very often I know I was left wondering, Nancy, why did I fall sick? I eat healthy, I exercise, I meditate, I love my workouts, I teach yoga, I practice yoga. I'm taking care of my mind body well-being. Like, how could I? And that's what everyone said. Like, how could she fall sick? Like, she's not reckless. And one of my teachers said to me, just because you take care of your health doesn't mean you're guaranteed good health. Accept that. And I accepted that, but I was also like, no, why, what really happened? And then I started getting into more researching more about stress. And again, when we think stress, we just thinking work stress. Are we thinking familial stress in a relationship and things like that? I was like, no, there's more to it. um, and even when, like, because I work with survivors, I've noticed they don't want to talk about the experience constantly, because you don't want to be that person. A, it's triggering. B, also, you don't want to be that person. So even as someone who had witnessed, I didn't want to be that person about what I was going through, because I really didn't want to be that person who was always being negative. And that's not, there's also that disconnect, because that's not how I'd known myself, to focus on the negative. But I went through something so transformative in a bad way, that how could I not talk about this bad experience? So there are all these inner conflicts going on as well. And I feel, as women, especially in this patriarchal world, we are so used to labels that define us. She's a happy woman, she's a perky woman. But the minute you start to feel like, but you go through these experiences, how am I going to be happy about what happened to me? Um, these are things I don't talk about much. And I mean, these are more part of conversations, but the whole idea about the book was to make people, especially women, feel less lonely in their journeys. There's so many women, and I write about this in the book. Like, I interviewed them, and they have chronic illness, and they're like, "Oh my God, thank you so much for talking to us," because people have this perception that if you don't look ill, that means you're not ill, or if you look pretty, whatever pretty means by their definition, nothing is wrong with you, or if you are physically active, you're not in pain. So it's like redefining who you are in your mind and then for people on a daily basis. Or how do you write when the pandemic hits? Or the whole concept of mindfulness, right? I'm in the ER fighting for my last breath. And people are like, you watch these movies and shows and people talk about um clean up your browser. And I still remember, I remember joking with my husband after I came home. I was like, that wasn't even something on my mind. I had nothing to clean up in my browser, but that wasn't the point. I mean, people who really have near that experiences don't talk about this crap. Like, it's the people you didn't get to say a goodbye to. That's what's on your mind. When you see, when you watch this shows, a lot of them are like, oh my god, can you, like somebody saying this to their best friend, like, buddy, can you clean up my browser before they find anything? That doesn't cross your mind. You're going to be gone. It's just in that. It's not even the people who hurt you. What stays with you is, who do I not get to say a goodbye to, and why me? That why me is, acceptance comes much later, and in that moment it's like, why me? Intently and intensely, I hope they find this book because it'll make them less lonely. It'll make them realize they are not in their struggles alone. There's so many people going through similar experiences. The other thing I wanted to point out was, Nancy, like the world that we live in, its content is so curated. When you're looking at someone's social media feed, it's like everything is the best thing. I know so many people who've gotten divorced over the last 2, 3 years. If you ever looked at the social media feed, you'd feel shitty about your own relationships because it was like so perfect. And like, what am I doing wrong? But that's my whole point. It's inauthentic. But we all have our insecurities. We all have our vulnerabilities in different ways, right? So this book will make you realize you're not alone in anything. Our struggles are very universal. Trauma is very universal. How it impacts you might be different, but you're not unique. I'm not the only one who ended up in the ER because trauma turned into a full-blown disease, right? And this is from the Ayurvedic perspective. A Western practitioner might not even accept it. So I don't even go there, even though a nurse in the ER said this to me, that she believes this is what is happening. So I'm like, I know, I believe it too, but it was kind of good external validation. So yeah, I hope it gives people the strength to manage their lives better. I hope it gives them the courage to own their stories and to go through life with more mindfulness. Um, when I chose to come out and share about this crime that I'd witnessed, I've gone back in my head. Could I have done that differently? So the mindfulness aspect, right? I'm being mindful by not sharing what happened, and it's a choice, and I choose to stick to it. But I did not early on, right? So because then no one else pays a price, you pay a price. I felt sick. So it's like, I hope it really, I invite people to embrace mindfulness in not just about, oh, showing up to a yoga studio. No, 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 no. How you wake up to how you go to bed. Are you mindful about how you are at work, how you're with family, how you're with friends, how you are with yourself? So incorporating self-care, and no, I don't mean just going to a spa, I mean emotional self-care on a daily basis, mental health self-care. Because these are take for a lot of women I know, including my clients, they're like, oh yeah, I do self-care. They'll go to a spa. And I'm like, that's physical self-care, which is great. But you know what? What about even taking out 15 minutes to sit with a cup of tea or coffee for yourself and telling your family, this is about no one talks to me right now? That will nourish you more than a massage. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm all for massages, but you know where I'm coming from. Just acknowledging that self-care has to be a daily practice, just like any kind of movement or meditation. So reminding people what these practices can do, how much of a difference it can make. And it's okay to fall off the wagon. We're human beings. But until such time that you remember to get back on, you're okay.
You use writing to heal. This is what this really comes down to, is you've been able to use your writing to heal. What are your practices like? Do you journal? I know you write beautiful poetry. That's how we met when I first,
Right.
you shared with was it your first poetry book or your second or third?
Kaleidoscope was
Kaleidoscope.
my
Yeah.
first. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was my
So
first.
that's been over a decade, over a decade ago. And how many other poetry books have you written in between this?
I want to say maybe 8 or 9 more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I should send you a copy of the one that I wrote about my mom. She um, passed away very suddenly in 2014, and I ended up writing a collection of poems inside of 4 days. I went back to India to edit it to see if I would get inspired sitting in a room. Nothing, my pen refused to move. So the collection was done in 4 days. I mean, the editing took what its time, but nothing. Like from the time we got a call, she was unwell, got on a plane, landed in Delhi, and she was gone. I never got to say goodbye. To the time we did her last rites, it was 4 days. And that's how long it took me to write that book. So that was the last poetry collection. Then I wrote a novel after that, Louisiana Catch. I did write a novel which was published in India called Perfectly Untraditional. That was in 2011, so literally 10 years ago, 10 Julys or August ago, so like literally a decade ago. And then I had started to work on another novel, which, I was working with an agent, then the agent decided to change professions, all of that, the typical publishing story. And then that novel sat on the side. But then for 7 years, I'd been working on Louisiana Catch. I spent about 6 to 7 years from the time I started to write it, research it, and it came out. So I really love the book for because I feel like it's not my voice. The characters have their personality, and it was such a validation of why you should spend time developing characters instead of rushing them. Because my first novel, Perfectly Untraditional, which really sat well with the audiences, I wrote it inside of 6 months. So versus this novel, which was about 6 to 7 years. So every character, like, I did not decide what the character would do, if it makes sense. Like, you're a writer, so you get it. It's like the character decided this is what they would do. So people were like, there were hashtags of what would Ahana do, things like that. So Ahana is the name of the female protagonist. It was also my first multicultural book because the male antagonist and protagonist are both Americans, and the female protagonist is Indian. I wanted to write a multicultural book. I wanted more diversity represented, and not just one story about South Asian women that they miss wearing a sari, which I don't know how to wear, or they miss their mom's recipes. We all miss our mother's food, period. It has nothing to do with culture. So I didn't find enough representation in stores. Plus, Ahana is a sexual assault survivor, and I work with survivors. So that part was inspired by working with survivors and how, knock on wood, I'm not a survivor, but teaching survivors has changed my yoga practice and my writing as a result of it. It's taught me so much more about patience and kindness and not being like this with wanting instant gratification by doing a headstand. It's like, how do you breathe and find your calm? Because you won't always have the space for a headstand. Same thing with writing. How do you write those 5 words instead of saying, I need to go to a writing retreat? So it's approaching and seeing the commonalities between yoga and writing. So Louisiana Catch was like in the works, and then it came out and it did really well. I won the Voices of the Year award for it, which Chelsea Clinton had won in the past. So that was a massive surprise for me. I had no idea. But it's just that for me, the biggest moment was at the book launch. There was a lady who walked up to me and she said, thank you for calling Hana a survivor, not a victim. It's words that matter and make all the difference. She was like, because I'm one, and I wish people would have called me a survivor instead of victim. So, I'd spent that time in terms of the lingo, the terminology, the sensitivity, the cultural stuff, the details. So it took time, but and so I was writing poetry while I was also working on the book, because a novel is an extended period of time, right? And for me, poetry happens like inside of a month, the book is done. It's always been that way. So it gets done, I like it right from this place, and then I back down. So yeah, it was like working simultaneously on prose and poetry at the same time.
It's nice to hear that someone who has had that experience could relate to you because you put so much effort into using the right words, like survivor. Once they're out of it, they're no longer a victim. They have to become a survivor. And
Right.
it's up to time for that to happen and how much support they have. So,
Right.
the work you do is incredibly important. And,
Thank you.
That brings me to, again, a full circle. I started telling you at the beginning of our conversation how I had lost a friend, and she was also involved with working with survivors of the sex
Mm.
slave industry. And it opened up a whole big um, new ball of wax for me, so to speak. And that's when I started getting into the language we use when it comes to this industry. You know,
Mm.
we call them underage women when there should be called children, and we call them prostitutes when they should be called victims, and we call them Johns when they should be called rapists. You know,
Yes.
if we stopped creating customers, we would no longer need the commodity. And I am a big advocate for going after the customer. So, you know, that when I read that you had written this book, it just really resonated with me. And I thought, oh, this is one I'm going to have to ask about and get on my shelf behind me here, because it's you know, the third largest illegal industry in the world, and it's a horrific crime to steal someone's child from them, regardless of where the child comes from. And
Right.
in my research, a lot of these children come from unwantedness. You know, they're in the child care systems, they're in foster care systems, they're in, you know, where they're not
If
watched
they go
over
missing.
enough, they go missing. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a horrific thing. And there's so many ways to, again, you know, to solve a problem, you have to have all these different perspectives and ideas to solve it, to nip it in the bud, you know, not just solve it here, you have to solve it at the beginning. And I think about big problems like that. So I'm excited about that book. But coming back to the poetry part of it, when you work with your survivors.
I work with them in just the yoga capacity. So it's limited what I share. It's very, very yoga oriented. And it's taken me a lot of learning to even I did a special trauma informed yoga teacher training for survivors. Um, and like even within the system where they are, their emotional state can be so heightened because some of them have Stockholm syndrome, right? So even they aren't told what the location is of the yoga class. It's not like a typical studio, right? Because they might invite their perpetrator. It's just because they have Stockholm syndrome. So sometimes there is a guard with a gun waiting outside, and it's like I have to maintain eye contact, but at a very gentle level. I will not wear my regular spandex that I wear for yoga. It's like loose clothing. Um, at any given time, they should be able to see the door. They should be able to see me. I don't touch them. I don't adjust them. There's no oils. There's no music. There's no. I never thought of yoga as provocative because it's such a part of my journey. But for a survivor, it can be a very sensual thing. So making sure they don't get triggered. So there's the whole yoga teacher training for trauma survivors is completely different. You know, because what I teach to my non-survivor, but now it's so interesting. I've started to incorporate trauma informed yoga in my regular yoga classes because not everyone identifies as a survivor. Like I'm making this up. A woman works for Goldman Sachs in the C-suite. She might not want to acknowledge that bit, but she might be taking a yoga class. And if I don't call it a survivor class, she might be more open to just taking a yoga class that says help you deal with stress, right? So I'm also like playing around with the verbiage so that it's more open and inclusive. Where and I'm like, for me, there's no judgment. If someone doesn't want to identify, that is their choice. Healing is not linear, and everybody is on their own path. But if I can create that space which is open to someone who says, "Hey, I'm a survivor," and someone who says, "Nothing is wrong with the world. I'm just here because I need a workout." Sure, absolutely. I'll curate a sequence that helps anyone who's feeling triggered.
We all have our little bits of trauma in us, whether we want
Mhm.
to admit it or not. So, yoga, of course, is such an amazing way to release all that, because our bodies do keep that score within us. And releasing it is so important. But identifying it first, accepting it, coming to that reality, that's the biggest step I think we all face.
Absolutely. And even like with Louisiana Cat, so the female protagonist, Ahana, she's a marital rape survivor. So working with survivors, I realized like if I believe the statistics is someone like 1 in 3 women are victims of intimate partner violence. So I'm like, when we think rape, we're thinking outsider. We even in the West, we don't have conversation. We tell our children stranger danger, but we don't tell our children that danger is at home. When the pandemic hit, I had so many friends who got triggered and came out to me, said, I was raped by this one, I was raped by this one, like the immediate family members. These are people I've known like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? So it triggered people. And so even when I was working in Louisiana Catch, like, because people have different opinions, and they were like, oh, why don't women leave bad relationships? You don't know where people are coming from. Some women have the financial ability, the educational ability, but might not have that emotional support at home, whatever home means, right? And people come from different spaces. If we don't get it, it's okay. I don't think it's anyone's place to judge. So that was another reason I wanted to write Ahana's character. Like, the women who look so put together, you don't know behind closed doors what's happening with them. And it's talking about rape, I don't believe is easy at any time. But imagine talking to your family about your spouse is raping you versus saying a stranger did it. There are questions like, did you do anything to incite it? Or, well, is it rape if it's happening in a marriage? So they're like, it's so layered. So I really wanted to spend that time highlighting that in the book, like how that, when the relationship closest to you that's supposed to protect you violates you, what does that do to your overall well-being? So on July 23rd, I am actually offering a 1 hour webinar. It's called, so Ayurveda is all into elements, much like Chinese medicine. So we are all made up of these 5 elements, and summer is called Pitta season, which is fire and water. So why do we get fired up in summer? Because people are also Pitta. Um, and so when in balance, think of fire when in balance. It's transformation, it's metabolism. Think of summer when it's balance. It's like you have this movement, you have this digestion going on. You're traveling the world, but when it goes out of balance, what happens? It's like you have like that drunk relative at a wedding who's all fired up, or at a barbecue, that friend who looks like a lobster because they've been out in the sun drinking too much beer or wine, eating way too much steak. So that's with them balance. So it's like, how do we balance our pitta in the summer season so we're not like the drunk mean uncle at the wedding? So it's 1 hour. It's on July 23rd. It's $55. All the stuff is on my website. And I genuinely believe it's going to be very helpful to people because Ayurveda is all about living in tune with nature, and I'll share simple tips like what spices can help you. There are times when you go to a yoga studio, you come back heated up because for this season, that yoga asana is not perfect. So I also have teacher training in Ayur Yoga, which is yoga using Ayurvedic principles, which is in which season should you be practicing what kind of asanas? Because if you're practicing heated asanas when it's 100 degrees outside, you are going to be a ticking time bomb. So how do you cool your insides, and as a result, how do you cool your mind? um, we all know people like in the writing who get very jealous, very envious, very competitive. From an Ayurvedic perspective, that isn't pitta imbalance. So it's not just like, it's a holistic way of living. How are you a better partner, colleague, parent, client, boss, business owner, human being, all of that?
Isn't it interesting how all these experiences, whether they've been good or bad along our journey, bring us to these points where it feels like you are where you are meant to be, right in the right moment. And it sounds
Yes.
like you're right there, right where you're meant to be. It's all coming together. And the message that you bring of how important our stories are, that's the most important part of it, I think. When we start to give other women that voice to
Hmm.
share their story, that's how we make change. And it's not that we're fighting anything. We're bringing back in balance, I think, the male and female um, energies that are required to have, you know, the way the world is supposed to work, I think. Um, but it does start, I believe, with our words. Our words are so important. The words we choose to use to describe things, and how we put them together. Thank you for listening. It's always a pleasure to have an author return to me after years of being away, and it was nice to hear from Sweta as she reached out to discuss A Piece of Peace, and it was nice to talk about Louisiana Catch. So I will be reviewing both of these books soon, and I have read Saris and A Single Malt, so I will share a link to that review in the show notes. And for the month of September in the Garden of Neuro, we are hosting a 30 Days to Publish workshop where we will host 4 workshops over the course of September with a purpose to publish. Have a publish-ready manuscript done at the end of September, and we will be working with Lulu Publishing to create this book. It is an anthology of art and poetry. So please come join us in live or recorded sessions to learn about the project, the process, the themes, and the purpose of this exciting project in the Garden of Neuro. Thanks for listening. This has been Write, Speak, Play, and I'm your host, Nancy Arvizu.